Hello all, and welcome to today's Hero Learning Series webinar, where we'll be discussing some hot off the press research studies that identify workplace health and well-being practices associated with the best outcomes. I am Jessica Grossmeyer, Vice President of Research at Hero, and this topic couldn't be more timely as we continue to see suggestions in mass media and social media platforms that suggest wellness doesn't work, and employers ought to use their scarce resources in other ways. And it's true, there are some programs that aren't effective. And yet, equally true, that some employers are implementing wildly successful initiatives that engage employees, improve population health, and demonstrate cost impact. So what sets the successful initiatives apart from the ineffective ones? That will be our focus today. We're still 230 days away from our large gatherings for members and non-members, we're still a few weeks away from our winter think tank, which comes at the end of February. If you are a Hero member, you are welcome to join us for the winter think tank. Registration is open, and we will be discussing the intersectionality between obesity and burnout. Employers can find more information by going to our website under the membership menu. And then we're 230 days away from our larger gathering for both members and non-members. The Hero Forum 2020 will convene at the end of September in Austin, Texas, with a focus on our theme, a 2020 vision for collective well-being. And we will discuss how group dynamics and social connections shape individual choices. Registration is not yet open for forum, but I wanted to mention it because our call for presentation proposals is out, and there's a deadline at the end of this month, February 28th. So get your proposals in if you'd like to be considered for Hero Forum as a faculty. And now with that, I would like to go to our panelist introductions for today, and they should all be on camera. These four esteemed researchers collaborated with me on the research studies that we're sharing today, and their full bios are available on the Hero website, but I'd like to augment that information with some additional remarks. So first of all, I wanted to go to Mary Imboden, who will be teeing us up for the webinar. Mary is not just a member engagement manager with Hero, but she is also my right arm in research. She's a research associate, and she led the writing for the first study that we published, which I'll share more about that in a moment. Some of you might recognize Mary's other hat as a membership manager, but she is also assistant professor of exercise science at George Fox University, where she conducts research related to exercise physiology and physical activity epidemiology. A quick skim of her research articles posted on PubMed identifies numerous studies focused on cardiovascular fitness, body mass index, accelerometers, and related topics. Thanks for joining us on today's webinar, Mary.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mary. Next up, we'll hear from Dr. Sara Johnson, who will share a high-level overview of the findings from the Hero studies. And as you will see in Sara's bio, she is co-president and CEO of ProChange Behavior Systems, is co-editor of The Art of Health Promotion, and a past recipient of Hero's Distinguished Mark Dundon Research Award. She shares a love of teaching with Mary, as she is also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Rhode Island. A quick search of Sara's publications on PubMed reveals a significant focus on use of the trans-theoretical model in behavior change interventions. She and her colleagues at ProChange were selected by Hero's research committee to lead the data analysis for the studies that we'll share today. And we were delighted to work with her team on this study. And thank you, Sara, for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Jess.
After Mary and Sara go through some of the research, Drs. Noeldner and Kristi Rahrig Jenkins will discuss the practical implications and applications of the research findings. Dr. Noeldner is senior consultant in the total health management specialty practice at Mercer with experience in clinical cardiac rehab, hospital administration, teaching, research, and many other areas. Stephen and I have long been collaborators on previous research studies as he was involved in the development of the Hero Scorecard. and currently serves as chair of HERO's Research Committee, which is a volunteer role. Thanks so much, Stephen, for being with us.
Thanks, Jessica. My pleasure.
And finally, Dr. Kristi Rahrig Jenkins also holds a research role with HERO, where she serves as co-chair of the Research Studies Subcommittee, which provided oversight of these HERO studies. Kristi oversees research associated with mHealthy at University of Michigan, and she served in several research roles there over the past nearly 20 years. One of the things I love about Kristi's work at the University of Michigan is how frequently they publish and share their research on the mHealthy initiative. One of the papers I reference quite a bit is one that Kristi authored in 2014, which validated self-reported absenteeism in their workplace. And that's allowed them to use absence as a metric and outcome for their initiative. She and her colleagues have published many papers related to culture of health, incentives, participation, and engagement, as well as this most recent work with HERO. Thanks so much, Kristi, for joining us today during our webinar.
Thanks so much, Jess.
These panelists only represent about half of the team members that collaborated with HERO on this study. I won't go into all of the roles and team members that contributed to this work, but there were no less than a dozen of us working together for about a year and a half to design, execute, and write up the studies. While collaboration of this magnitude does take more time and resources, HERO is committed to conducting research in this way because we feel it results in higher quality research and is eminently practical and relevant for employers and practitioners. And that's one of the key reasons we've got the HERO Research Committee providing oversight. At the end of the day, they help us to ask, what is the importance of this research? How is it going to be useful in the field? Thank you to our study team members who couldn't be on our webinar today. I imagine some of them are joining as participants and listening in. Just a quick note, if you want to read the full studies for yourself, the first study led by Dr. Mary Imboden was published in the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine in January. So if you go out to the JOEM website, you will see the study there available to you. The second study is available through the American Journal of Health Promotion. It's currently available as online first, so you need to look for the online first section and scroll down until you find the study, and that is now available on the website as well. So before we dive into content, we'd like to get you, our audience, engaged with us. We're about to launch a poll, so if you're busy multitasking during my introductions, it's time to pay attention. Your responses to this question will help determine how quickly we go through this next section of content, which is related to your familiarity with the HERO scorecard. So the question is, prior to joining this webinar, what was your familiarity with the HERO scorecard? If you're very familiar, that means you've completed the scorecard many times. If you're familiar, you've maybe completed it once. Somewhat familiar, maybe you haven't ever completed the HERO scorecard, but you're aware of some of the content. And not familiar, you haven't ever completed the scorecard and know very little about it. And so my colleague and our producer for today, Ariane, will be launching this poll for us. And you should see an opportunity to now click right on your screen using your cursor or your finger, I guess, if you're on your mobile device, to respond to one of these questions. We're seeing the polls come in now, so thank you to those of you who are voting. And it looks like we've already got 84% of you engaged, so let's go ahead and take a look at our poll results. Thanks so much for those of you who dialed in and responded. So it looks like we've got a really good mix here. Some of you have actually taken the HERO scorecard one or more times, but we've got quite a few of you who are dialing in. You're not familiar or somewhat familiar with the scorecard. So with that, Mary, I think you're well poised to give us a little bit more information about the scorecard. We will now all go off camera so that you can focus on some of the slide content, and then we will all come back on later on. And so, Mary, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you.
Thanks, Jess. And so because so many of you mentioned that not familiar or somewhat familiar, I'm just going to start with a brief overview of the scorecard. So the scorecard, it's a free web-based survey tool. that your organization can use to assess how your organization's health and well-being efforts compare to an inventory of recommended evidence-based practices. There's actually a US and international version, where the international version is typically completed to represent what practices an employer is using to promote health and well-being for the employees in a specific country. Once the survey is submitted, the person that completes the survey or the scorecard at your organization is going to receive an email message with scored results that help the organization identify areas of strength and areas they might consider improving, as well as a comparison against national averages and against other organizations of similar size and industry. Since the HERO Scorecard was initially launched in 2006, more than 2,000 organizations have completed it. Thanks. The scorecard has 6 sections, which are scored. The questions within these 6 sections are associated with points based on the research supporting the importance of a specific practice on health and well-being. There are 200 possible points if an organization indicated that they were implementing all of the practices listed. However, that is pretty unlikely that every practice listed on the survey will be relevant or even feasible for an organization. So we tend to see scores in the range of 90 to 120 points. And as you can see here, each section has different number of points. And that's because some of the questions in certain sections are weighted with higher scores, and because some areas have a lot more practices listed in them. There are several reasons for an organization to complete the HERO Scorecard and several benefits the scorecard provides. So first and foremost, it was designed to help employers identify practices that support more effective health and well-being initiatives. This purpose is primarily educational, and just by completing it, you may get some new ideas about how to strengthen your programs and initiatives. And that can help your organization with their strategic planning, because you can identify and prioritize specific practices to implement in the short and long term. And then assuming there's enough data, it also allows organizations to benchmark their efforts against what others in the country are doing, as well as in your industry type and for organizations of similar size, as I mentioned before. In addition to the scored questions within those 6 sections on the scorecard, there's an optional outcome section, and it's optional because completion of this section does not influence the scores an organization receives. However, this section can be used to understand what types of outcomes employers are seeing emerge from their efforts. And questions in this section might include things like participation rates, employee perception survey results, as well as health and financial impacts achieved. The data submitted to this optional section supports HERO's ongoing research on effective practices. So as more data have been collected from the HERO Scorecard, researchers at HERO and within our member organizations have begun to see the potential of the scorecard as not just an educational tool as it was originally designed, but as a research tool and best practices. So as a research tool, the scorecard data has been used to assess many important questions to advance our field. One study by Getzel et al. Using the HERO Scorecard assessed how individual employee healthcare insurance claims data for 33 organizations completing the HERO Scorecard were linked to employer responses to the scorecard. Organizations were categorized into low and high scores based on their overall scorecard score. We then compared healthcare cost trends in the high versus low scores, and findings showed that the high scores experienced significant reductions in inflation-adjusted healthcare costs, averaging an annual trend of negative 1.6% over 3 years, compared to the low scores whose cost trend remained stable. So this concludes that the HERO Scorecard could be used to predict healthcare cost trends among employers. In another study, HERO assessed 11 determinants of health coaching program participation, 6 employee level and 5 worksite level variables. Subjects in the study included a random sample of about 34,000 employees from 52 companies that completed a survey, including demographic measures, as well as questions regarding social support, financial incentives, comprehensive communications, senior leadership support, and others. And results showed that employees were more likely to enroll in coaching programs if they were older, female, and in poor health, and if they were at work sites with fewer environmental supports for health, clear financial incentives for participation in coaching, more comprehensive communications, and more comprehensive programs. And once employees were enrolled, program completion was greater among those who were older, did not use tobacco, worked at a company with strong communications, and had fewer environmental supports for health. And then in a study by Grossmeyer et al., so Jess here on the webinar today, using the scorecard data, evaluated stock performance of publicly traded companies that received high scores on the HERO scorecard based on their implementation of evidence-based workplace health promotion practices. Results showed that stock values for a portfolio of companies that received high scores in a corporate health and wellness assessment appreciated by 235% compared with the S&P 500 index appreciation of 159% over a 6-year simulation period, concluding that robust investment in workforce health and well-being appears to be one of the multiple practices pursued by high-performing, well-managed companies. So again, while designed as an educational tool, the data from the scorecard provide research opportunities, as you've seen in these studies that I just went through.
Great, thanks so much for that overview, Mary. Due to time, I want to actually bring us right into Sara's section, which will focus on the research study highlights. So we're going to skip over our next poll, and Sara, we'll turn it over to you.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much. So as Mary just highlighted, the HERO scorecard provides important input for research, and I'm going to just briefly describe today 2 studies that we conducted using HERO scorecard data. The objectives were first to explore the factor structure of the HERO scorecard to develop a reduced set of measures that would be applicable for research purposes, and then to examine the reliability and validity of that shortened version. So in study 1, we conducted some measurement development analyses and identified a final set of 4 best practice factors, including organizational and leadership support, program comprehensiveness, program integration, and incentives. And what we're going to spend the lion's share of our time talking about today are actually the result of the second study, which really was conducted to examine the extent to which those 4 factors, those 4 implemented best practices, predicted 3 key outcomes for employee health and well-being initiatives. And those 3 outcomes were participation in health assessments and biometric screening, impact of health and well-being programs on health risks and medical costs, and finally, perceived organizational support. So we analyzed data from over 800 organizations who completed the HERO scorecard between January of 2015 and October of 2017. After eliminating organizations who had just a single employee or missing data on the scorecard, we were left with a data set that included 812 organizations. And as you can see, about just under half were medium-sized, and about a third were from the northeastern part of the United States, but the organizations were pretty fairly equally distributed across the U.S. Now, we ran a series of models on each of the outcomes that I mentioned, controlling for important covariates such as organization size, employee gender, and employee age. So what did the models tell us? Well, in a nutshell, after controlling for those covariates, incentives significantly impacted participation in health assessments and biometric screening, but none of the other outcomes. On the other hand, organizational and leadership support also significantly impacted participation in health assessments and biometric screening. In fact, organization and leadership support was more strongly associated with participation than were incentives. But in addition, organizational and leadership support also was a significant predictor of health risk and medical cost impact and perceived organizational support. Interestingly, program comprehensiveness and program integration were not significant predictors in these models after controlling for the other factors, including organizational leadership support and incentives. So overall, the key takeaway is that among these 4 implemented best practices examined, organizational and leadership support, which represented 10 specific practices from the HERO scorecard, emerged as the most consistent predictor of participation, impact, and perceived organizational support. Now, while the importance of organizational and leadership support for the effectiveness of health and well-being initiatives has long been recognized, there really hasn't yet been a lot of research linking specific practices with the different types of outcomes. That research is really just beginning to emerge. So we wanted to take a deeper dive into what the 10 best practices on this organizational and leadership support factor were. So we did that, and we essentially boiled them down into 4 categories of organizational and leadership support practices. The first category was targeted communications, which reflected that employers targeted separate health and well-being communications to employees with different roles within the organization. The second bucket of practices really reflected strategic planning and reporting. These best practices included having a formal written strategic plan for health and well-being and ensuring that multiple stakeholders regularly reviewed program and initiative data. Inclusive engagement reflected support across all levels of the organization, meaning that there was leadership support of health and well-being, managers and supervisors were supported in their efforts to improve health and well-being, the organization had champions, and that employees were actively involved in and felt supported in their efforts to promote health and well-being. And the final category was organizational commitment, which reflected that employers' health and well-being values were incorporated into the mission statement and organizational goals, that the organization had health supporting policies, and that members of the senior leadership team clearly saw the connection between health and well-being and the broader business objectives, things like profitability and sustainability. Now, you may have noticed that in the center of this slide, we examined the extent to which organizations who completed the scorecard reported that they were engaging in the best practices that comprise each of these categories. And what we noticed is that only about 40% were utilizing targeted communications, whereas nearly 80% were engaging in practices that reflected organizational commitment. So it really speaks to there being an opportunity for improvement in targeted communications and strategic planning and inclusive engagement, whereas we seem to be doing relatively well with organizational commitment. So I'm going to hand it back to Jessica, Stephen, and Kristi, who are going to discuss the practical applications of these findings.
Great, thanks so much. And while we're getting on camera here, I would like to just mention that in your control panel, you should see a handout that is a PDF, and it lists all 10 of the specific organizational and leadership support practices that was just reviewed by Sara briefly. Thanks so much, Sara, for that great overview, and thank you again, Mary, for giving us an overview of the scorecard. So now, with Stephen and Kristi on camera, what we'd like to do is discuss the practical application and implications of the study. So as we consider these practices that were identified as the most important for outcomes, one of the questions that, or some of the questions we'd like Kristi and Stephen to address are, which ones have you experienced to be most challenging in the organizations that you work with? How are, and why are some of these challenging? And then how are some employers overcoming the barriers associated with implementing some of these practices? And Stephen, we'll start off with you.
Thanks, Jessica. And ironically, perhaps, the best practice that is most highly associated with most of the positive outcomes is, in my experience, probably the most challenging one for many organizations. That is organizational and leadership support. And I think that stems from a number of different factors and different different for different organizations, of course. But it can start with positioning where the organization places responsibility for the health and well-being initiative. For example, if it's led by the benefits group, it may have more of a benefits orientation and may focus on activities or even incentives that are associated with health plan design, like health premium differentials or HSA contributions. And it may not necessarily, and again, this isn't a judgment, this is an observation, and there are challenges and opportunities for everyone in this, but benefits-based organization might not have the comprehensive vision of impact of well-being on talent and the business outcomes. Think about finance organization that sponsors the well-being initiative. That might have a very bottom line focus, financial return on investment. Some organizations place the well-being initiative within the medical group. In that context, there might be a strong focus on physical health and mental health, and again, maybe not as much on talent and business outcomes. And then a few rare organizations actually place a very high value on where they place the well-being initiative in the organization, to the degree that they create a position called Chief Wellness Officer or Chief Health Officer. It's a C-suite position, high profile, high authority, and also related to and directly connected to other high authority and high visibility individuals. And I'll talk more about the challenges and opportunities around positioning in the organization in a moment. Other areas that we see organizations challenged with, as you saw from the research as well, is strategic planning. Not having a formal written strategic plan is similar probably to taking a road trip to maybe an unknown destination without a map or a GPS app. And also, as you all know, there are many, many different vendors and products and services in the marketplace today, and they all look great. And they all are great to some degree, but are they great for your particular program? And if you don't have a strategy and a tactical roadmap that identifies what your initiative needs, then you're just going to think everything is great, and you'll be completely confused, and that's a big challenge as well. Another area of organizational and leadership support that is often a challenge is the support of supervisors and mid-level managers. As we all know, those individuals are charged with productivity and production goals within the organization. And if a supervisor or manager perceives participation in well-being activities as a hindrance or impediment to productivity goals, that could be a problem. But on the other hand, if they recognize that the health and well-being of the population, the workforce, enhances productivity, enhances organizational engagement, and enhances creativity, then they'll be more likely to support health and well-being initiatives and their work groups' participation in those. Still, other areas, I think, are senior leaders that provide tacit support for the program by funding it with a budget, but beyond that, maybe fade to the background and aren't visible supporters or active supporters or meaningful supporters of the initiative, and that's probably a big opportunity as well. And then finally, I would say that there are organizations that may say the right things and even develop a strategy and have health and well-being as a prominent element of it, but their actual practices don't align with that. For example, I've worked with organizations where we've talked about this, and we've talked about the value of health and well-being for the population and work-life balance and all the implications of the different dimensions of health and well-being, and they say, that's never going to fly in our organization because the expectation and the practice is we work 12 to 16 hours a day, almost every day. There's no time for health and well-being. So obviously that's a challenge as well. So how do I see organizations overcome this? Well, starting with positioning in the organization. I mentioned that, and this again wasn't a criticism, it's just where organizations tend to locate the sponsorship of the program. I think if you don't have a highly prominent role at the C-suite, which is pretty rare, as I mentioned earlier, I think then the opportunity is to create alliances and collaborations with many different stakeholders in the organization so that collectively you can marshal your forces and have a aligned strategic plan to really live out the health and well-being initiative broadly and deeply within the organization. For example, probably should have a relationship with the finance department if you aren't housed in the finance department, or with the medical group if you're not housed there, or with health and safety, with diversity and inclusion, with corporate social responsibility. So all of those different groups have their own constituency and their own champions and their own budgets. And together, you can find some pretty great synergy. On the subject of mid-level managers, supervisors, what can you do to support them? I think it's really important that there's specific training, specific communication, specific reporting that goes to this group of individuals, because it is so very important. As we all know, if you're ever a supervisor, you create a microclimate in which your work group works, and it either allows and enables health and well-being and practicing it, or it can inhibit it. So we would like to see the enabling of health and well-being right at that level. And then, of course, grassroots, wellness champions, kindness clubs, ambassadors, individuals who it's not their formal job to be health and wellness practitioners, but they're promoters, supporters, enablers, and connect people with the right things, and ideally model those behaviors themselves. And then I think finally, senior leaders can do more by creating videos that can be delivered through wellness portals, through mobile apps. They can lead walking groups. I know one organization that the CEO has a established time every Wednesday at noon hour. He sponsors a walk, and this is a multi-site organization. It actually is a county government, and we find that different people from different work sites are coming together to walk with the CEO. That's a powerful statement of the value of the well-being initiative in that organization. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and Jessica, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Stephen. It's really helpful to hear. I know you work with so many employers, and it's really helpful to hear some of the challenges in the trenches, because it's easy for us as researchers to point to, this is what you should be doing, but you know, we know that in reality, some of these practices are really challenging. And before I turn it over to Kristi, Stephen, I'm going to tee up a question for you to think about while Kristi is sharing what's been her experience with some of this. The question comes from Valeria Tivnan, who's joined us today. Hi, Valeria. What would you recommend that practitioners do when the following situation occurs? You've got senior leaders on board, they're supporting wellness, but then there's a change. Some of the organizational members leave at the senior level, and new leaders that come on board are not necessarily as supportive of wellness. What can you do to help address that challenge? So Stephen, I'm going to let you ponder that for a moment, and we'll come back to you. Kristi, we'll now turn it over to you to share what in your experience has been challenging about some of these practices, and you know, how have you been able to overcome it specifically at University of Michigan or with other employers that you've worked with? And I am seeing other questions coming in, so keep those coming and we'll address as many as we can. Go ahead, Kristi.
Great. Thanks so much, Jess. And thanks so much, Stephen. We feel so fortunate that you're able to be on the call today, because you have such a wealth of knowledge given your position, being able to work with all different employers. I'm going to be taking a little bit of a different perspective approach than Stephen, and that I'm going to be talking more specifically about the University of Michigan and some of the challenges that we're trying to overcome here. So one of those in regards, like Stephen said, you know, the one that seemed to have the most impact, organizational and leadership support, is also the one here too that we seem to find to have one of the greatest challenges with. And more specifically, one of the things that are related to that is our faculty engagement. The challenge is trying to be able to better understand how to engage our faculty in our employee wellness initiative, and it's a challenge for a couple of reasons. One of those being that faculty tend to see our health and well-being initiative as something that's more for staff than for faculty, something that's not necessarily for them. And then also that we had received some strongly suggested advice from upper level leadership who has since moved on, that we might want to consider not communicating to faculty very much, if possible, for various reasons. And so with that challenge and the reason why we had that challenge, some of the ways that we had tried to overcome that, when we say tried, we're still in the process of trying to figure it out, but we certainly are pushing forward with some of our activities. So one of those was we felt like it was important to be able to talk to those individuals who were involved in the issue, right? So many times when we have a challenge that comes up, we tend to go seek out the voice of the people that the challenge is referencing. So we set up a faculty engagement committee where we had faculty members from the university join that committee, and we had meetings with them to talk about what are some of the types of things that would seem exciting, that would really light you up in regard to being able to participate in our health and well-being initiative. And some of the ideas that came about, one of them was to be able to have some type of incentive that would be able to benefit their students. So maybe some type of scholarship that could be put in place to be able to benefit their students. Another one is be able to come up with some type of communications that were used sporadically that might be able to speak to the faculty members and them as leaders. So them being as leaders of their students and them being role models for health and well-being in that regard. So those are some of the specific things that were mentioned. And like I said, we're still in the process right now of being able to sort of winnow through some of those comments and some of the discussion and be able to go forth and apply those things. And interestingly enough, the question that was lobbed over to Stephen right before I jumped on was the question about the switch in leadership. And we recently had a big shift in our leadership as well, but we have very, very supportive leaders at the university. And so the leaders that had passed on to other positions, they, as I had mentioned, suggested that we limit the amount of faculty communications that were sent. With this new set of leaders, we're in the process of having discussions with them and figuring out if that is still true, or if we should, develop these communications that might target the faculty members and be able to better engage them that really resonate with those faculty members. So that was one of the specific challenges that we faced. Another one was in regard to evaluation. So we know that part of our organizational leadership support is being able to communicate our data with our stakeholders on a regular basis. And one of the things that we had a particular challenge with was trying to determine how we might go about collecting some of not really collecting our metrics, but being able to analyze them, and who is going to be the spokesperson that would be able to convey this information to our stakeholders. So one of the challenges more specific challenges that we had in that regard was being able to determine, because we are an academic university and we have so many rich resources and wonderful faculty members who are very intelligent and do really important work, do we use internal faculty to be able to evaluate some of our wellness programs, or do we seek out external members that are leaders in the health and wellness field to be able to conduct some of those high-level evaluations that we can report back to stakeholders. And so that was a particular challenge because although there's a skill set at the university, the specific topic area in regard to evaluating at a macro level a health and well-being program, there's not lots of researchers across the nation and across the world, quite frankly, that do that very specific niche area type of research. So there was some, challenges in regard to, again, who would be able to conduct this type of evaluation. And one of the ways that we overcame that was to try and have discussions with some of our faculty members internally and have maybe some type of committee or oversight committee to be able to either conduct that work, or the oversight committee would be able to assist or provide input with the evaluation if a vendor was selected, an external person was selected to be able to use that, or if we were to go with that approach. So really interestingly, I think the bottom line is here at University of Michigan, when we have an issue or a challenge, we like to go directly to the source and engage those people, be able to hear their voices and hear how we might be able to resolve the challenge or overcome that challenge. I think that's really the bottom line. So if this, external versus internal researchers conducting the evaluation, let's go to those internal researchers and be able to have discussions around them about what they would like to see. So again, just that's, I think, the bottom line is be able to hear everybody's voices and create a forum which is safe, that people can be able to express those opinions.
Yeah, fantastic ideas, Kristi. Thank you for that. You guys have been at this for how many years at University of Michigan?
Oh gosh, we started back with our first health risk assessment in 2009.
And what was the year?
2009.
2009, so 10 years. Happy anniversary. And you've experienced some of these things. The leadership change, thank you for addressing that question. Before I toss it over to Stephen to answer Valeria's question, Holly has a question for you specific to a university setting. So now we're getting into some free consulting here, which is great. For a wellness professional in a university setting that has university support, so they have support, whatever that means, but not funding. So maybe lip service, maybe they're actually walking the talk, who knows, but they don't have funding. What do you see as a feasible approach to use? And while you're thinking about that, one of the things I would like you to also think about is how the university is working with some of its external partners, like its health plan, its community initiatives, where you might not have the resources, but there are others. But then I don't want to totally influence your answer. So be thinking about that, and we'll come back to it. Stephen, so Kristi answered Valeria's question based on what she's seen at University of Michigan. What would your recommendations be when you've got leadership support, but then they go away and you got to start over again? What do you do to help prevent that from being an issue, and what can you do to address it when it actually does occur?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Valeria. And let me start out by saying you can be confident that there are other organizations that have faced this and overcome it and are thriving today. And I think that really goes to some of the things that I was talking about earlier. It's the alliances, the collaborations, the relationships that are built throughout the organization that can help overcome the change in regime at the top. There are a variety of organizations that have long-term initiatives that have survived leadership changes several times already in the course of 20 years. And it goes to the fact that now health and well-being is really who we are. It's not just what we do, it's who we are. It's part of our DNA. And that's really the goal, is to have it so embedded in the culture, so embedded in the organization, so prolific that regardless of turnover and change in the organization, there's a strong belief. And again, it may start with an organizational vision and mission statement that specifies that the health and well-being of our employees and their families are of prime importance to us and are core to our business success or our organizational success if you're not a commercial business. But that it starts there. And then the policies and practices that exist reinforce that vision and mission, and the relationships in the organization help support that as well. One example I can use in particular, if your organization has a health and safety division, that's a really great collaboration to have because, one, it has high profile because there are OSHA requirements for reporting. They often have infrastructure already built and a reporting system already built and resources. So you really should be closely aligned with the health and safety group in the organization. And that's not the only one. That's just one example. But there are others that have a strong foothold that can help sustain you through top leadership changes and even other organizational changes through time.
Great. Fantastic suggestion, Stephen. Thank you so much for that. So there is really a lot that we can be doing to help build the initiative integrated into the fabric of the organization. I'm going to invite Sara and Mary to join us back on camera again. And Sara, I have a specific question for you to be noodling on while we go back to Kristi to answer the question specific to the university setting. And the question that Priya asks is, how did y'all define leader in this study? Now, she didn't say y'all, that's me, but how did you define leader in this study? So something to be thinking about, Sara. We'll come back to you. Kristi, the question again from Holly was, if you're in a university setting and you've got so-called support but not funding, what do you do in terms of recommended initiatives and how do you move forward?
Thanks so much, Jess, and thank you so much, Holly, for the great question. I think not all is lost here. I think we can definitely still do some great things even though there's not funding. One of the suggestions that Jess mentioned was to be able to partner with anybody that you might have at the university. For example, the benefits office is a great example. Some of the partnerships that we've had in regard to with the benefits office is being able to have some type of banded approaches for copays, for example, in regard to being able to help out our low-wage earning population with their health and well-being. Maybe be able to assist them with some type of smoking cessation or tobacco cessation medications. So there's certainly some things that you can do directly in regard to their health with your benefit program colleagues. And another suggestion is, yes, look out to your local community and be able to promote things that the community might be offering. So some of those things might be, the various runs that might be offered in your community. I know that certain cooking classes and chef demonstrations are offered in my community. Be able to promote those things, anything that is local and a credible health and well-being initiative might be another way to be able to approach that. If you have hospitals that are nearby, be able to promote any type of screenings, health screenings that they might be offering. So again, I think it's just partner, and really be able to communicate and promote those things that would benefit the health and well-being of the employees at your organization.
Kristi, as I was listening to your response, what you're talking about is program integration. So there's internal program integration, and then there's internal and external program integration. And this reinforces, Sara, I believe what you said earlier. Program integration strategies, which are part of the HERO scorecard, were one of the factors associated with perceived effectiveness in the first study. And so we need to be thinking about all of the practices and these factors on the scorecard and not just the organizational and leadership support strategies. It's just that those sort of bubble to the top when it comes to outcomes. So thank you for that response, Kristi. And before we get over to Sara, I would like to tee us up for the next question. Stephen, I'm going to go back to you. And this one might be a brain teaser because now you got to really think about, and I know you've probably seen this scenario. So you're with an organization and they are very production focused. They've maybe had multiple layoffs. There is somewhat of a divide and maybe even a distrust relationship between office workers and floor managers. So Veronica, thank you for this really tough question. We know that this is a reality. When you're working in that kind of an environment, how do you promote well-being? What's an effective strategy? So Stephen, we're going to come back to you. Sara, how do you define a leader in this study?
So what's tricky is that we don't define leader. The participants from each organization who completed the scorecard defined leader from their perspective within the organization in response to questions like, leaders support the health and well-being initiative in many ways. So while we clustered together items that dealt with leaders, that really is up to the individual interpretation of the member of the organization who's completing the HERO scorecard. So it is a valid point that it may mean different things in different organizations depending on the organizational structure.
Great. So Stephen, I'm going to give you a few more minutes to think about that other question. Mary, I'm going to go over to you to add on and add to Sara's question. Mary and I work very closely with the HERO scorecard probably every week. We're looking at the data. Mary, when you think about the questions in that specific section, can you help us understand which questions or what types of questions might be focused at the senior leader level versus managers, supervisors in this broader set of practices? You're on mute, Mary.
Yep. So are you asking what specific questions are asking about this, or?
Yeah, do we ask about questions specific to senior leaders versus other levels of leaders on the scorecard?
We do. So it's broken down into senior leaders and their support in the health and well-being initiatives, as well as middle managers, people that are actually supervising you on a day-to-day basis as well. So we do break that up when someone is completing it, but like Sara said, it's still up to how they're interpreting the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And Priya, I hope that answered your question. If not, we'll have another one back at us to clarify. So Stephen, our brain teaser question, what do you do when you're in an environment that's really focused on production, results? They've got layoffs going on. There's a divide between office workers and floor managers. How would you promote well-being in an organization like that that's so challenged?
Yes, thanks, Jess, and thanks, Veronica, for that question. I've seen that before, and I'll start by saying power to the people. And what I mean by that is, in this situation, you really need to empower the grassroots level even more. And because there's mistrust of mid-level managers and supervisors, maybe even senior leadership, and that you see things crumbling around you. But all you really have is your workmates, your friends, and your own motivation to do something about your health and well-being and help others. So what an organization can do to fan that and that spark and make it a flame is really to do things that will support the grassroots efforts. So even minimal funding. Can you, if you don't have a formal wellness champion network, great thing to develop in this kind of environment. Get the people who are on the floor at the front line together and give them at least some minimal resources. Maybe it's just a few prizes that can be given out to people in the course of some sort of challenge or competition that you create at the grassroots level, even without a lot of resources. Maybe it's getting together and counting steps. Almost everyone's got a trackable device right now to track steps, and there are platforms out there that you can aggregate the results and see leaderboards and things like that. Or even paper and pencil. Put a poster on the wall and do self-report in that case. But the point is that reward people for getting involved and supporting each other, and this is where developing those strong internal ties among employees is really important. And we all know that there are formal and informal leaders in the organization, right? And certainly if it's a production type of setting, if it's a unionized workforce, there are probably union reps that are go-to kinds of people. But even informally, in situations where, let's say, a new benefit or a new change in policy comes around, there's always somebody in the group that's the go-to person, right? Not aside from the management. It's Sara or Joe or whomever that is the person that seems to figure these things out and has a point of view on it and is willing to share it. Those are the kinds of people that you can get to rally around health and well-being, and find more and more of those people, build a network out of those people, and give them some support. And I think that's the best strategy to start as you continue to work up through the organization to gather trust and support from the higher levels.
Great, thanks so much, Stephen. Kristi, would you have anything to add to Stephen's question? Not specific maybe to that type of environment, but some of the challenges associated with that. I know that there have been, like you said, some of the groups at the university setting who have felt like, well, this isn't for me. There might be a divide. Anything else you would add to Stephen's answer about how you engage the employee?
I think one of the I want to echo Stephen's last comment in regard to trust. I think that's a really, really important component to the resolution of some of these issues. And so one of the things that we have done in regard to be able to establish some more trust in how we utilize data is we created a graph and a communication that we put up on our FAQs surrounding how we utilize these data and where is the data flow. So I think transparency and honesty and being able to communicate as much as possible are all things that in any relationship or any type of organization helps develop trust. And so I think those are the themes that we try to stand by.
Okay, thank you for that. We are just now running to the top of our hour. There are more questions, and so I'm sorry we're not able to get to all of them, but thank you so much to everyone who has tuned in to our webinar today. This is being recorded, so if you want to come back and revisit, you may do that. And if you have any questions about this study, you can feel free to contact myself, Mary and Bowden, for more information at HERO. And with that, thank you, Stephen, Sara, Kristi, and Mary for joining me today. And with that, we will conclude our webinar. Thanks so much and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.